Imagine standing in a packed Roman arena, the air thick with the scent of blood, fear, and unwashed masses, the deafening roar of the crowd drowning out your own frantic heartbeat. Suddenly, a hush falls over the mob. All eyes are fixed on the center stage, where a trembling prisoner, eyes wide with terror, stands chained to a wooden post. He knows what's coming next, and so does the audience, their anticipation building into a fever pitch. With a dramatic gesture, an executioner steps forward, whip in hand, and the grisly spectacle begins. Welcome to the shocking, gruesome, and utterly brutal world of punishment and execution in the Roman Empire, where justice was not only harsh but theatrically cruel, intended as much to entertain as to terrify. In a society built upon conquest and order, punishment wasn't merely about retribution or justice. It was a powerful political tool, meticulously engineered to showcase Roman supremacy and control through displays of merciless power. From the earliest days of the Republic, Romans had mastered the art of sending chilling messages through spectacular public punishments. Take, for instance, crucifixion, perhaps the most infamous execution method ever devised. Far from an innovation of the Romans themselves, they perfected this torturous death, making it synonymous with their empire's iron-fisted rule. Crucifixion was reserved for slaves, rebels, and non-Roman citizens, particularly those who dared challenge Rome's authority. It was designed explicitly to be slow and agonizing, a prolonged torture that could stretch over days, the victim suspended helplessly between life and death. Bodies were nailed or tied to wooden beams, left to succumb slowly to suffocation, exposure, dehydration, and infection. As the victim weakened, vultures and scavengers would gather, further humiliating and mutilating the condemned. Famous rebels like Spartacus's followers were crucified along the Appian Way, their broken bodies lining the roads as a gruesome reminder to anyone considering rebellion. This is the fate awaiting those who defy Rome. But crucifixion, as horrifying as it was, represented only the tip of Rome's bloody iceberg. Romans delighted in creativity when it came to execution, especially in their arenas, the Colosseum being the grandest stage of all. Here, punishment was transformed into elaborate entertainment. Convicted criminals, traitors, and war captives were frequently forced into combat, often unarmed or lightly armed, against highly trained gladiators or ferocious wild animals. These spectacles, known as damnatio ad bestias, were designed explicitly to maximize suffering and public humiliation. Imagine the terror of prisoners thrust into the arena's sandy pit, stripped and trembling, the hot sun beating down mercilessly, their only company snarling lions, tigers, or bears, starved for days to enhance aggression. Death rarely came swiftly. It was often a gruesome, prolonged ordeal cheered enthusiastically by thousands of spectators demanding ever more blood and spectacle. But Rome's appetite for punishment extended beyond mere gladiatorial combat or crucifixion. More elaborate psychological methods were often employed, particularly for those deemed threats to the empire itself. For instance, the execution known as poena culae, or the punishment of the sack, was reserved for patricide, murder of one's own father, considered one of the gravest crimes in Roman society. The condemned was sewn into a leather sack along with live animals, typically a snake, a rooster, a dog, and a monkey. This bizarre collection of animals symbolized confusion, betrayal, and chaos. Once securely tied, the sack was tossed into a river or the sea, the condemned left to drown alongside the panicking creatures. It was a symbolic and literal cleansing, removing a profound moral pollution from Roman society. The Romans also excelled in torture methods explicitly designed to extract confessions or information. The infamous scourge, whips embedded with metal spikes, hooks, or bone fragments, could strip flesh to the bone in a few brutal strokes. Victims were stretched tightly over wooden frames, muscles taut and exposed, increasing the whip's effectiveness. If whipping failed to produce results, Romans employed other horrifying tortures, such as burning with heated metal rods, the slow crushing of limbs, or even the notorious fire shirt, a garment soaked in pitch and set alight, effectively roasting the victim alive. These methods were not merely sadistic pleasures, they were calculated instruments of psychological terror, spreading dread among Rome's enemies and dissuading potential traitors. For Roman citizens accused of capital crimes, execution methods varied according to social rank and the severity of the offense. Lower-class citizens might face hanging or beheading, both relatively swift compared to other methods. However, Rome's upper class enjoyed the dubious privilege of suicide. Forced suicide, paradoxically viewed as a dignified option, allowed the condemned some measure of control and dignity. Prominent Romans like Seneca and Petronius were famously forced to choose their method of death, typically slicing open their veins in a warm bath, their demise regarded almost poetically by contemporaries. Yet, even this privileged death was often a coerced public spectacle, demonstrating the ultimate authority of the emperor over life itself. One of the cruelest Roman punishments, however, was reserved for Vestal virgins, priestesses charged with maintaining the sacred flame of Vesta. Breaking their vows of chastity was considered a dire threat to Rome's very safety. The punishment? Burial alive. Yet even here, Romans showed a twisted sense of mercy and ritual. The guilty Vestal was not violently forced into a hole, but led ceremonially to an underground chamber equipped minimally with food, water, and a bed before being sealed inside forever. This macabre punishment symbolized the precarious balance between Roman religious purity and cruelty, illustrating how the empire's sense of justice could manifest as both compassionate and mercilessly brutal. Not all executions involved physical torment. Sometimes the Romans executed through psychological devastation. One such punishment was damnatio memoriae, literally condemnation of memory. Rather than killing the body, Romans aimed to obliterate an individual's very existence from history. Statues were defaced or destroyed, inscriptions erased, and names forbidden from utterance. Prominent victims included emperors like Nero, Domitian, and Commodus, whose legacies were aggressively wiped from history, as if they never existed. This punishment was psychological annihilation, a chilling reminder of the Roman belief that memory and legacy were as vital and as vulnerable as life itself. The Romans' approach to punishment wasn't merely about deterring crime or suppressing rebellion. It was fundamentally about maintaining their vast empire through terror, spectacle, and absolute dominance. Each horrifying method was deliberately public, each execution a clear, visceral statement about Rome's power and the absolute futility of resistance. These practices weren't hidden away, but celebrated openly, immortalized in stories and art, transmitted from generation to generation. Romans understood well that fear was a powerful currency, one they spent freely and extravagantly to maintain control. Today, these barbaric practices seem utterly unimaginable, a testament to humanity's darker impulses. Yet for the Romans, such punishments were not simply barbaric or cruel. They were essential components of their civilizational identity, markers of strength, justice, and order. These shocking and brutal executions were as integral to Rome's imperial success as their roads, aqueducts, or legions, serving as a powerful reminder to both their citizens and their enemies that Rome was omnipotent, invincible, and utterly ruthless. As modern viewers, reflecting upon these horrific punishments can provoke feelings of revulsion, fascination, and disbelief. Yet it also poses profound questions. Are these ancient Romans fundamentally different from us, or do their brutalities simply reveal a disturbing truth about humanity's eternal capacity for cruelty when cloaked in the guise of justice? The shocking, grisly punishments of the Roman Empire, despite their horror, force us to confront uncomfortable realities about our past, and perhaps even more unsettling, about our potential future. So next time you walk the serene ruins of the Colosseum or gaze upon Roman relics in a museum, remember the blood-soaked sand, the anguished screams, and the haunting echoes of Rome's brutal justice. These aren't just dusty historical relics. They're grim reminders of how civilizations maintain control, often through violence cloaked as spectacle. The shocking ways Romans punished and executed their enemies and criminals aren't merely history. They're warnings etched forever in stone, flesh, and memory, resonating even into our modern world, a haunting reflection of humanity's perpetual dance between civilization and savagery. Imagine, for instance, the execution method known as vivicamburium, a particularly horrifying punishment reserved for enemies who committed egregious acts against the empire, such as arsonists or traitors who threatened Roman sovereignty. Victims of this gruesome fate were publicly burned alive, a spectacle intentionally designed to be slow and excruciating. Often bound to stakes in crowded public squares, the condemned would be set aflame as onlookers gathered, some appalled yet compelled to watch, others cheering enthusiastically. The flames were meticulously controlled, extending the agony, transforming justice into theater. This horrific death underscored the Roman belief that crimes against the state required a visible, terrifying reprisal, reinforcing the message that treachery would be met with the severest consequences imaginable. Another uniquely inventive punishment was the tunica molesta, or tunic of torment. Reserved predominantly for early Christian martyrs and other political dissidents, this horrific execution involved clothing the condemned in a garment thoroughly saturated with pitch or resin. Set ablaze before large audiences, the victims burned brightly, transforming into human torches whose suffering illuminated the night sky. The sadistic brilliance of this punishment lay not only in its cruelty, but also in its vivid symbolism. Dissidents consumed by flames, their destruction serving both as entertainment and as a powerful, fiery warning to any who considered challenging Roman authority. Romans also demonstrated their terrifying ingenuity through methods designed explicitly to humiliate and degrade. Consider the practice of public exposure, often employed against those accused of adultery or other social transgressions. Offenders were forcibly stripped naked and paraded through crowded city streets, subjected to relentless jeering, ridicule, and sometimes physical assault by the mob. This ritualistic humiliation was intended to strip the condemned of their dignity, shattering their reputation irreparably. The spectacle sent a clear societal message. Morality, as defined by Rome, would be upheld at any cost. For those unfortunate enough to be convicted of high treason, punishment could extend beyond their own physical death to their entire lineage. Such individuals faced proscriptio, a terrifying decree that sentenced not only the accused, but also their families to execution or enslavement. All property was seized, names were erased from public records, and descendants were forever stained with dishonor. It was an absolute eradication of lineage, a ruthless attempt to purge perceived threats completely from Roman society, reinforcing the chilling notion that betrayal bore consequences reaching far beyond the immediate guilty party. Roman punishment also extended creatively to exile, particularly for political opponents whose death might inflame public opinion against the emperor or ruling elite. Rather than martyring influential figures, they might instead be condemned to remote, desolate islands or distant provinces. Renowned Roman poet Ovid famously endured this fate, banished by Emperor Augustus to the bleak shores of Tomis, modern-day Romania. Stripped of friends, status, and familiar surroundings, exiled individuals languished in perpetual isolation, psychological torment that could rival physical torture in severity. Such exile served as a powerful tool to silence dissent while avoiding the politically inconvenient spectacle of execution. Equally sinister was the punishment known as decimation, specifically designed to discipline Roman legions that displayed cowardice or insubordination in battle. In this terrifying process, 1 in every 10 soldiers was randomly selected by drawing lots and subsequently executed by their comrades. Forced to carry out these executions themselves, often through stoning, beating, or stabbing, the surviving soldiers were psychologically scarred, yet starkly reminded of their collective responsibility to Roman military discipline. Decimation wasn't merely punishment, it was an unforgettably brutal lesson in unity, obedience, and the uncompromising expectations of the empire. Romans also employed subtler yet equally insidious punishments designed to slowly erode the will and sanity of prisoners. One such practice involved perpetual darkness. Victims were sealed away in windowless underground cells, deprived completely of natural light. Time lost meaning, senses dulled, and prisoners slowly descended into madness. Such prolonged psychological torture could break even the strongest spirits, offering Romans an effective, silent means of punishing those whose crimes demanded relentless cruelty. Yet perhaps the most chilling aspect of Roman punishment lay not in specific methods themselves, but in the enthusiastic complicity of ordinary citizens who flocked to watch and cheer these horrors. Roman society normalized, even celebrated, such brutality, embedding punishment deeply into the cultural fabric. Spectators brought their children, vendors sold refreshments, and artists memorialized these gruesome events in paintings, mosaics, and statues, capturing forever Rome's morbid fascination with suffering as spectacle. Ultimately, the shocking breadth and imaginative cruelty of Roman punishment illustrate not only the empire's absolute power, but also the darker dimensions of human psychology. These ancient atrocities compel us to reflect upon our capacity for brutality, the thin veneer separating civilization from savagery, and the unsettling ease with which cruelty can become normalized within society. The Romans remind us starkly that justice, devoid of compassion, can rapidly descend into sadism, and that civilization itself can serve as both a veneer and a catalyst for humanity's darkest impulses.